Today we are reviewing over Tool Runtime, which is an MCP gateway that I created. Essentially, the goal is to be able to curate MCPs from multiple different sources into one MCP that you can leverage via API key to be able to manage and control your MCPs and the users and agents that have access to them. And so having full visibility and capabilities into provisioning the MCPs and the tools necessary for agents and giving you full control over when they're being called, how they're being called, and what access agents have to these tools. And so giving you full control. Right here you see the dashboard where you can see the total tool calls and the API keys that we have available, and some of the telemetry with the tools that are being called, and just some basic insight into what's been happening. Of course, there are different capabilities. Specifically, we can export these analytics and dive deeper into some of the specific analytics. But as of right now, what we'll do is dive into the toolbox. So what this does, this toolbox is essentially a registry of MCP tools that are available. They can be searched and or filtered. As of right now, I'm pulling in the public directory for all of the MCPs, as well as any MCP that's created through the Tool Runtime server. And so you'll see here that ultimately there's a plethora of different tools that we can save and connect with and leverage. When we select the details, we can start identifying the specific endpoints, the tools that are available, as well as the documentation that is available for this. And so we can, of course, connect to these, and we can then add our authentication to it if necessary. We can save them and rank them, so we can go through and identify which ones are valuable and things that we want to leverage and utilize. But essentially, once these are saved, we can connect to them, and then we can leverage these when we are going through and creating an MCP for the consolidation of this. Before we do that, essentially what we did is put together a AI tool creator. So this tool creator essentially allows for you to chat with an AI chatbot to walk you through the entire process, start to finish, for how to create an MCP. Essentially what it does is it goes through a question and answer, identifying specific resources, documentation. It asks you a question to identify specifically what you're looking to build, and then it takes you through these different steps for the specification, architecture, design, and then ultimately will automatically code it and submit the repo. And so you'll see down here there are a few different ones that are already created. And what it essentially happens is when we can open this, we have an IDE that's embedded in the browser, and this is essentially the code that the agent developed. And so the user can come in here and identify specifically what capabilities there are that were implemented from that API or from the AI agent, and they can go through and edit, update these, and then of course as you go through and do your GET request, we can amend our initial GET, and we can even then update it to GitHub. So when we do come in back into here, we'll see our GitHub that's available, and this is automatically posted then. Once this is posted, we have our Tool Runtime delineator. This Tool Runtime delineator essentially goes through and listens for this, and then ultimately lists it onto the registry if the user wants to submit it publicly. And so this is the entire registry for all of the tools that you've created, as well as there are different management of these tools at an organization level. So once you have created your tools, you have pulled ones from the registry that are available. Essentially what we do is we need to build the MCP, i.e. the API key that leverages these tools. And so essentially when we're coming into here, we can select the MCPs that we have saved. And what we do is we select the ones that we want to leverage and create the MCP for. If we need more insight, or if we need to edit the authentication or headers, test various things, we can. But essentially what we do is we select the MCPs that we want to use, and we can then press next. And then what this does is this shows all the tools that are available for this MCP, and we'll select the ones that we want to leverage, and then we'll press next. And so this then says, hey, we're utilizing these two MCP servers with the authentication that was provisioned, and we want to specifically give the agent the ability to leverage these specific tools. And so then we can name this, just name this test MCP, and we'll create an authentication method that will go through and leverage as an MCP authentication. So whenever this API key is used as an MCP tool, it will go through and authenticate against it and know exactly what tools and the authentication methods that are associated with those MCP servers that are selected. And so you'll receive the entire MCP.json that you can then embed and copy into your client, whether it be Cursor or Claude or anything like that. And so essentially what's happening is that we created a streamable HTTP MCP server. This MCP server ports always to the toolruntime.com/MCP. And what we do is we provided the authentication method. And so this API key essentially is what's going through and telling the tool runtime what tools it has access to and what capabilities in terms of authentication and as well rate limiting and various other capabilities. And so what we do is we can copy this and then go through and manage all of our API keys. And so here are all of our various API keys that we have created that we can then go through and identify the different credentials for. We can view the key that we have access to or get the config again. And then ultimately when we come into here, we'll be able to identify various, edit the servers, we can edit tools that are associated with it, modify the rate limits, and basically have different ways to manage our API keys. So then essentially what's happening is we're giving these MCP server API keys to a plethora of different agents, and then we're able to go through and track various different capabilities from that. And so we do have different ways to test the MCP authentication. So we have an inspector tool that will go through, and once it loads, it might take a moment, but essentially what it does is it loads in our MCP, and then it has the specific tools that are associated with it, and then we can just do test calls to it to inspect it. And so this might take a moment to load, but we can always come back to it. There it goes. And so essentially, yeah, we can go through and select any of the keys that we have available, and then what we do is we can then do our authentication and test all the tools there. We do have AI agents where we can then test this MCP in an agent, so we can actually do real-life calls as well and build out agentic systems. The goal is to implement workflows to embed the MCPs into the AI workflows. And then, of course, the main thing is then diving into the tool insights. And so as we're looking at the actual tools, we can see all of the tool calls and the associated information that is happening. So you'll see here that these requests are then identifying, the organization, the user, API key, as well as then the MCP server and the input-output logs. And so this is really important. So whenever a tool call is happening, essentially we take the input response and then the tool will happen, and then we take the output response. So this is great for debugging, identifying how it's functioning, and having granularity into this. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg to gain insights and analytics into the specific capabilities of the MCP tools. Of course, there are different capabilities in terms of logging tool calls, policies that we can implement on terms of what's allowed, how many tools are available, how frequently they can be called, and then identifying usage for these. And so this would be like this would be associated with the usage, but then we ultimately can go into the data and analytics here. And so the data and analytics, ultimately, I don't have any here in the last 30 days, I guess, but essentially what it does is it'll have the tools and all of these servers that have been called, and then what essentially we can happen is we can then view the analytics for this tool, and we can then pull in any of the analytics and requests and track all of the tools and the graphs and success rates for each of these API keys, i.e. the MCP tools that we've provisioned and given access to the tools for. Of course, we have a plethora of different resources that are available, like getting started, FAQ, different ways to contact, and our community resources. And then further, there's an admin portal here, and this then allows for us to go through and manage the various users that we have. We can invite people, we can give access to specific capabilities and provision capabilities for organizations, as well as admin rate limits for specific MCPs that are available and utilized. And then
course, on the back end here, these are just the platform analytics for how the organizations are being able to identify what's occurring. And then essentially we do have a user access here, and so we can then look into the profile for this user. So each user has a profile, and so they can go through and create an about section, add links, and see their whole analytics, and then ultimately identify the different tools that they've created. So different users could go through and find other users for the tools that they've created and utilize those within their own instance if they have a publicly available profile. You can then ultimately see the analytics for the activity that these users has occurred. So anytime that they've done anything, we can ultimately track the activity and usage of the platform. And then, of course, their network. So if you're inviting users or collaborating with one another, we can identify, different status updates or different learnings that people have had, and then ultimately editing your settings to pull in your GitHub repositories, or even change your privacy settings, where if you're maybe not wanting to have specific visibility into who has visibility into your profile, you can of course change that. But yeah, this is the tip of the iceberg, and I hope that you find value and interest in this. So yeah, thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions.